Carry Me Home by PropMaster. Rarity. Spike paced outside Carousel Boutique, his stride subtly vibrating the windows of the building. Every so often he would pause, looking anxiously at the boutique before resuming his route. Ponies trotting past gave Spike a wide berth, though many gave small smiles or waves his way. Every pony knew Spike, after all. The great assistant to Princess Twilight, the protector of the Crystal Empire, and resident dragon of Ponyville. The ponies of Ponyville called him Gallant, now, a true, gentle drake. Though they didn't know it, in that moment, Spike did not feel any of those things. Today he felt old. He was still so young, and he had hundreds of years of experience ahead of him. He was aware of that, but dimly. In this moment he felt every piece of difference from the little whelp that had been carried by Twilight through the doors of Carousel Boutique, and had seen the most beautiful pony he'd ever laid eyes on. Though years had passed and he'd had grown up, that feeling never left him. That moment always was a part of him, shaping who he'd become. She had always been his why, his inspiration for his bravery, the foil of his young heart, the unobtainable goal. The front door to Carousel Boutique opened, and Twilight Sparkle stepped out. She was taller now, and her mane shone with light and shadow, mimicking the time of day she was named for. Her neck had grown longer, more regal, and she'd grown into her wings. She was a proper princess now. She reminded Spike of Luna more than Celestia, if he was being honest, a fact that he knew irked Twilight, though she'd never admit it. Twilight looked up at Spike, and Spike stared down at her. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her lower lip trembled with constrained emotion. She didn't attempt to muster a smile for his sake. Spike knew that her heart was breaking all over again, just like all the times before. Spike swallowed, grimacing at the dryness of his mouth, and spoke quietly, his voice as soft as he could manage. It was a bassy rumble, still, a powerful thing he had tempered with careful practice. "How is she?" Twilight moved closer to him, reaching up and placing a hoof against his cheek.
"She's ready to see you."
Spike inhaled slowly, looking up at the boutique's upper floors, searching for an open window and finding none. How? Asking the question nearly broke his heart. He wanted to be inside, with her, not relegated to the outside looking in. It was a scene that had become too common for Spike over the last few years.
"I have a spell. It's temporary, of course, but, well, you know how it's been. It's hard for her to see you, as you are. She's confused. I've been trying to think of something that would help, and this is all I have."
Twilight said softly. "Do it," Spike said without hesitation. He did not have time for hesitation. She did not have time for hesitation. Twilight nodded, her horn lighting up. Spike felt the magic settle over him like a blanket, and he opened his eyes, glancing down at himself. He did not look or feel any different to his eyes, but Twilight was now looking down at his left foot. She spoke quietly.
"An illusion. You look like you did as a baby dragon."
Spike nodded. "Okay." That was all he could say. Twilight turned around and went back into the boutique. A few long minutes passed, and Spike resisted the urge to pace. Holding in place and watching the door, Twilight returned a few minutes later, Sweetie Belle flanking her. Sweetie Belle was beautiful in her old age, her mane's colors having faded to gentler hues. She was a mess of streaked makeup and tears, and she stared down at Spike, her mouth a little O of surprise, and she looked at Twilight. Twilight smiled at her, and Sweetie Belle understood what had been done. She smiled at Spike, her horn lighting up, and with a flash of light she brought a familiar red couch into the grass, her teleportation magic flawless. Twilight smiled at Sweetie Belle, and then looked back into the boutique.
"It's ready."
Her voice echoed out.
"Twilight?" "I'm here, Rarity. Do you need me to help you outside?"
Twilight called, raising her voice for the unseen unicorn behind her.
"Yes, please, darling."
Spike swallowed, his eyes wide. Twilight turned, returning back inside, and a minute later she emerged, her horn brightly lit, within the violet aura of Twilight's magic. Rarity smiled down at Spike.
Oh-ho! Spiky, you're here!
Spike was struck speechless. Rarity was as he'd last seen her. Her beautiful violet mane and tail turned platinum white with age, her horn elegantly polished, her mane curled to her impeccable standards. She wore makeup, a careful application that enhanced her aged grace. Her limbs trembled, and it was obvious that moving pained her, but she held her head as high as she could as she walked, assisted by Twilight's magic. Her blue eyes, those sapphires that had so entranced Spike as a child, were as beautiful as ever, their faded color only more appropriate to her new coloration. Almost shocking against the stark whites of her mane and coat, the diamonds on her flank still shone, as bright as the day he'd seen them. She smiled at Spike, her eyes locked on the baby dragon before her.
Spiky Wikey, it's been so long!
He'd been there yesterday, and the day before that, and every day for a week now, as he'd stood watch over the boutique, overseeing the family and friends and partners that had come to pay their respects. Perhaps at first, many had assumed that it was another bout of the elegant unicorn mare's classic dramatics. But as her condition had worsened, the visits had become in earnest. Many realized that this may have been their last chance to see Rarity. This time, it was Spike's. Spike cleared his throat, his voice emerging as a youthful squeak, the voice he hadn't heard for nearly a century.
Hello, Rarity?
Rarity beamed down at him, and she nodded to Sweetie Belle.
Twilight has been saying how you wanted to see me. I'm so glad to see you, Spike. I haven't been feeling my best, I'm afraid.
Sweetie Belle smiled, and gently pointed to Twilight.
Rarity, Twilight is over there.
Rarity stared at Sweetie Belle for a moment, her eyes uncertain, and she looked to her right, spotting Twilight. She smiled.
Twilight! Yes, and her mother?
Sweetie Belle sighed, and reached up, gently hugging Rarity.
I love you, Rarity.
Rarity smiled, her nose burying itself in the mare's mane and inhaling, and her blue eyes closed.
Sweetie Belle, I love you too. No need to fuss, I just want to talk with Spike.
Sweetie Belle stepped away from Rarity and smiled tearfully up at Spike, before she trotted inside the boutique. Twilight stood beside Rarity, and gestured to the couch.
Do you want to lie down, Rarity? I think it'll be more comfortable for you. Oh, that sounds lovely, Princess, thank you.
Rarity said softly, allowing herself to be led to the couch. She grit her teeth as she climbed up and settled upon the plush pillows arrayed on the couch, and she smiled at Twilight, letting out a little sigh as she relaxed in a more comfortable position for her body. Twilight smiled, looking at Spike.
I'll be inside. Call if you need anything.
Spike nodded. Thank you. Rarity smiled and waved a hoof at Spike, gesturing to the edge of the couch.
Come here, Spiky Wacky. Why don't you tell me what you've been up to? It's been so long since we had time to chat.
Spike crouched down. Uncertain as to how the illusion would react, he crept forward, and carefully lay his chin on the edge of the couch, resting his nose next to Rarity as she stretched out. He could smell her perfume, something with a fancy name that he chose to forget in that moment, because all he cared about was that she smelled nice, as she always had. He smiled at Rarity. It has been a while. Rarity giggled, pausing to cough daintily into her hoof.
No need to be shy, Spike. Not between us old friends. How are you?
I'm good, Rarity. He didn't know what else to say. There wasn't much else to say, except the gentle lies that remained in this moment.
Come now, Spike. You're being coy with me.
Rarity's eyes narrowed, and there was a moment of clarity that Spike saw flicker through them.
I've raised enough nephews and grandnephews to know when a young colt, or drake, is telling untruths. Did something upset you?
Spike bit back a choking bark of laughter. She always knew how he was feeling. She'd always known how he felt. She'd been eternally generous with her time and affection toward him as a child, and as an adult she'd stayed just as close. Even when her business empire took her away for long periods of time, he got his emotions under control. I'm sad and worried, Rarity. Rarity frowned, reaching out and touching him on the nose with one trembling hoof, the efforts of the movement nearly exhausting her.
Oh, Spike, whatever is the matter?
I'm afraid of losing a friend, Spike said, trying his best to bring some truth to the moment. Rarity chuckled, her mirth broken by a brief coughing fit that had her head low and her chest heaving. Spike reached out with one claw, steadying the frail unicorn. Rarity recovered after a moment and smiled at him.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not well, I'm afraid. But you were saying, a friend?
Spike nodded, and Rarity reached out, stroking his nose.
Oh, Spike, how could you ever worry about something like that? You're a wonderful little dragon. Any pony would be lucky to have a friend such as you. I certainly feel that way.
My friend, they're leaving, and they won't be able to come back. I'm afraid I might not ever get to see them again, Spike said, feeling his eyes well up with tears.
Oh, well,
Rarity sighed.
That is sad.
It is, Spike croaked, and Rarity gently continued to rub his nose. She probably saw herself running a hoof along the top of his head, or something. Spike didn't care, though. The simple touch was everything to him.
That is the way of things, though, isn't it?
Rarity said after a moment.
Things change, children grow, people move, parents grow older, mother and father, children. It is how things must be, is it not? So, even though it may be sad, it is also a part of life. For all the good things in life are made all the sweeter by the sad ones, aren't they?
Rarity said, her voice strained with the effort of such a long speech. Spike stared at her, quiet and contemplative, and managed a small chuckle through the hitching of his breaths. Oh, Rarity, I could spend another 80 years with you and still find new facets of your beautiful soul, just like your diamonds. Rarity stared at him, a gentle smile on her face, her eyes searching, and Spike smiled at her. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke.
80 years? Has it been so long?
Spike could have hit himself. He clenched his teeth, looking away from her, shame at his slip-up making his whole body shake. It's been a long road, Rarity. He couldn't lie to her. Rarity stared at him, confused.
But you're so small. Is it... what is...
Her eyes closed, and her horn lit up, a blue aura flickering weakly as her magic touched Spike. Spike felt the blanket of the illusion prodded, and Rarity inhaled slowly. Her eyes opened, and they were sharp.
Twilight. Twilight did this for me, didn't she?
She was worried. I'm bigger now. We were afraid you'd get scared, Spike said simply.
Scared? Of you? Never!
Rarity smiled, reaching out and touching his nose again. She could detect the hurt, though, in the trembling of his body as emotion threatened to overwhelm him, and she gasped.
I have been frightened of you, haven't I?
Yes, the last time you saw me as I am, you screamed. We were afraid for your health, Spike said. Rarity was quiet, her eyes filling with tears.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. You didn't know.
Still, I'm sorry, Spiky Wikey. You've always been my gentle Drake. Do you forget that?
Rarity looked down at herself, as if seeing herself for the first time, and a hoof clapped over her mouth.
Oh! Oh my.
Spike stood up and raised his voice.
Twilight!
Twilight was there in a flash of purple magic, her eyes wide and worried. Spike gestured to Rarity.
She's getting upset. She knows I'm under an illusion spell. She seems lucid, but I'm... She is right here, and she would appreciate not being talked about like a piece of meat,
Rarity said, one eyebrow arching primly.
Twilight Sparkle, I demand you remove this illusion on Spike at once.
Spike and Twilight shared a long look, and after a moment, Spike nodded. Twilight exhaled a slow sigh, and her horn flashed. Spike felt the illusion drop away, like a veil being lifted, and his eyes locked on Rarity's own as she looked up, up, up to his face. Her hoof raised, trembling, to her chest, and her ears fell flat.
Goodness!
She murmured, her blue eyes filling with tears. Spike lay down on the grass in front of Rarity, trying to make himself as small as possible. Hello, Rarity. Rarity's eyes widened at the deep rumble of his voice, and she looked at Twilight hesitantly.
Princess? Princess Luna? Is that Spike? Yes, Rarity, that's Spike,
Twilight said, not bothering to correct Rarity. Rarity nodded, taking a deep, shaking breath.
Goodness! Spiky... No. Spike. You've grown up.
Spike chuckled to himself. That's what Pinky always used to say. Rarity smiled, looking at him, her breaths calming, her hoof lowering. Twilight nodded to Spike and returned back inside the boutique. Rarity swallowed, glancing back at Twilight as she left before turning her full attention to Spike.
So, here we are. You're resplendent.
Spike's eyes widened slightly, and he felt a blush hit his cheeks. Oh, thank you. Rarity giggled, her eyes roaming over him, taking him in.
A dragon. A full dragon. You have wings.
Her eyes widened at the declaration, and she leaned forward.
You have wings!
Spike looked at his back, glancing at the folded wings at his sides. I do.
Oh, Spike, please stand up and open them for me. Let me get a really good look at you,
Rarity said, breathless. Spike nodded and slowly stood up, stepping away from Rarity. He rose to his full height, his neck curling upwards, his chest puffing out proudly, and he opened his wings. The green membranes like emerald bolts of cloth. Rarity smiled at him, and clapped her hooves delightedly.
Goodness, a proper dragon you are! How wonderful!
Spike laughed, folding his wings to his side and lying down in the grass next to her, resting his head on the foot of the sofa once more. Rarity reached out, touching his nose. She smiled.
Incredible! Simply marvelous, darling,
she said, pausing to cough. The coughing grew worse, shaking her whole body, and Spike reached out to steady her again, holding her until the fit passed. Rarity looked back up at him, wiping her mouth carefully.
If you're so big, darling, then I must be an old mare indeed.
You are still as beautiful as the day I saw you, Rarity, Spike said, smiling at her. Rarity smiled, tapping his nose with one hoof.
Always the charmer.
Always for you, Spike said softly. Rarity blushed, covering a smile behind one shaking hoof. She composed herself quickly, looking around.
Why are we out here?
You wanted to see me, Spike said. Rarity looked up at him again, and then back at the boutique, and nodded.
Oh, yes, that makes sense. We're visiting? I'm sorry. Things are a bit...
Spike nodded. Yes, we're visiting. His heart sank as he saw some of the confusion return. We're just talking.
Oh,
Rarity said. She swallowed, looking down at her hooves, and coughed. The coughing was over much more quickly this time, but left the unicorn mare weakened and breathing heavily.
oh, I'm sorry.
It's fine. I promise, it's fine. Spike said gently. Rarity smiled, her lips trembling, and she reached out and wrapped her hooves around Spike's nose, her frail body clinging to Spike.
Spike. Spiky. I'm terribly frightened. Suddenly, and I can't articulate why.
Rarity said, her voice barely a whisper. Nothing could ever hurt you while I'm here, Rarity, Spike said quietly, his voice a bare breath, afraid of blowing too hard on the weak pony.
I know, but I'm afraid that something is going to happen, and I won't be able to see you again. It's silly, but this dread, it's rather terrible,
Rarity said, her voice quaking with emotion. I'll do anything to help you, Rarity, Spike said. Anything for you, Rarity.
Hold me,
she said quietly. He did. He picked her up, cradling her gently, and she clung to him, coughing fitfully. She nestled in his arms, and Spike was struck by how light she was. She was like a chiffon and lace that she worked with, just barely there, but beautiful and so delicate. He held her as she shook, and coughed, harder. He held her as the breaths became more difficult. She murmured, her voice just a bare wisp of air, whispering nothings to him, smiling sometimes, crying others. Spike held her as she slowly drifted to sleep, and the breaths in her became less and less. And finally, Twilight, Spike cried, his voice a whisper between sobs as he held Rarity to his chest, and he carried her home.